great pleasure to introduce our postdoctoral fellow, Richard Stupart, who comes to us from the LSE, where he completed a doctorate titled Bearing Witness, Practices of Journalistic Witnessing in South Sudan. With a wide range of interests centered on journalism, media, conflict, and humanitarianism, while here at the center, Rich has been researching the emotional dynamics that are involved in conflict reporting. A former student representative for the Young Scholars Network of ICRIA and senior fellow for the African Good Governance Network, he is author of 5 research articles with another 3 invited publications on the way, producer of 2 terrific podcasts for the Center on Journalism and Conflict in Africa, and leader organizer of 2 very well-attended international reading groups on emotions and witnessing. Please welcome Rich as he talks to us on journalism and its challenges in South Sudan.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for making it today, this evening, morning, wherever it is that you are coming in from. So the talk I'm going to give will be for about 30 minutes, and then I'd really love to just take questions and sort of develop the conversation from there and in ways that people are interested in. Thank you, Bobby, very much for the introduction. As Bobby mentioned, I'm going to be talking about a small slice of a larger project, which was my PhD, looking at the work of journalists in South Sudan. Just as maybe an entry point to chat about the background to the project. So this was my PhD work involving looking at the work of journalists reporting in and on the conflict in South Sudan, who'd been based in the country at various points in time, and was made up of a mix of interviews, so with journalists working in Juba and in a couple of outlying areas in South Sudan, as well as journalists working in exile from places like Nairobi and Kampala in Uganda. And I'll talk a little bit perhaps later about why journalists would base themselves in those countries and some of the risks that sort of came with that. This was then accompanied as well with ethnographic field work. So I spent some time in Juba and some time accompanying journalists working on an investigative reporting project into alleged war crimes by the state in Upper Nile region. I'm not going to focus too much on sort of methodological issues and issues from fieldwork. If people would like to bring those up in the chat, you're absolutely welcome to. If people have questions, please do just pop them in the chat, and we'll use those as a basis for getting the discussion going once I've finished. Okay, so where's my little share screen icon? There we go. So as I mentioned, what I'm going to talk about for the next half hour is a slice of a larger project that was looking at essentially the questions were, what are the challenges facing journalists trying to report from South Sudan? And how are journalists able to circumvent or negotiate to the best degree possible those kinds of challenges, both to get journalism done at all, so to be able to access stories, report on them successfully, but also to report on those stories in ways that both the people they're working with and wider audiences to kind of recognize as journalism. Today, I'm going to focus specifically on the issues of the challenges to journalism safety and of a larger selection of things in the broader project. There are 2 that I want to highlight in particular. And one of these is the role of the country's media authority, and closely aligned with its national security services, just the equivalent to the Americans in the audience of the NSA in South Sudan. And then on the other hand, there's a question of what the impacts of, quote unquote, the dire, terrible economics of doing journalism in a place like South Sudan, or just foreign correspondence generally. And this is a conversation that will be familiar to a lot of people who've looked at how hard it is to find the money to do foreign reporting these days. I want to kind of talk about that a little bit. So to start with, I'd like to chat about the media authority and its role. Now, within South Sudan, the National Security Service was ostensibly the sort of spooks of the government whose job it is to maintain and look after national security matters. Amnesty, in a weird stroke of serendipity, published a report last week talking about how the NSS has fairly ubiquitously engaged in both practices of wiretapping and general surveillance, but also extrajudicial detention and occasionally execution of activists, civil society members, and journalists and media workers in South Sudan. And so the fact that those 2 organizations have a relationship to each other is a part of what has made life something of a headache for journalists in South Sudan. Now, the media authority itself, without getting into a background of the conflict in South Sudan, for which there's honestly no time in 30 minutes, was established initially as an organization in the country intended to give some sort of legal structural framework to issues of media work, journalism, news reporting, that kind of stuff. And on paper, it's an interesting organization because it came about as a combination of partly the government, partly media organizations, and partly various non-governmental or NGO humanitarian type organizations, such as UNESCO had a hand in this. There was an organization from Norway, Internews, coming together and trying to create a legislative framework for the doing of journalism in the country. And the feeling was, to quote one of my respondents, that journalism was in a kind of a wild west. There wasn't anything like an ombudsman or an authority that wasn't going straight to courts or the Ministry of Information to deal with issues arising out of journalism. So the Media Authority was created to fill this sort of gap. And the interesting thing about it is that on paper, this is an organization that looks like everything. If you've ever been in a public policy and media course, looks like all of the best things that you're supposed to have. And this is unsurprising given the involvement of a lot of the NGOs that were around in creating it. And the Media Authority Act that creates it says wonderful things like that it will represent all groups, it'll defend journalists doing public watchdog journalism, mass media will be protected from censorship. There are whistleblower protection clauses. So in the act that creates the Media Authority, if journalists are not compelled to reveal sources, no government licensing will be required for those who wish to practice journalism as a profession. And there'll be no licensing for periodicals, newspapers, publications of various kinds. There won't be, again, government licensing practices, but also, and then, it probably didn't need to be stated explicitly, but in the Media Authority Act, there'll be no unlawful arrest, detention of journalists, that sort of misbehavior. So the Media Authority as it exists in law is in many respects a sort of model organization for media management and sort of good practice for an ombudsman. For anyone who's dealt with South Sudan or who's come across the context of journalism in the country, though, or any experience with the Media Authority firsthand, there's this marked divergence between the Media Authority as it exists in fact and the Media Authority as it exists in law. And as it exists in fact, so in the way, and this is based on sort of journalists recounting interactions with the Media Authority and observing some of the relationships between them and the NSS, I want to comment on three aspects of how, in fact, this organization diverges from the good in law ombudsman type role. The first of these is that there's evidence and widespread belief amongst journalists that the Media Authority collaborates quite closely with the National Security Service to prosecute journalists for criticizing the state, for any kinds of sort of publishing acts that in a very loosely determined way might infringe on national security or affect certain sensitive issues around the conflict. This is in part through a collaboration where journalists feel that the Media Authority is engaged in a monitoring role. So they will do a lot of Google searches. They will get the newspapers from Juba every day and go through them. And journalists that write particularly naughty things end up getting called into the Media Authority and get castigated, criticized for their work, which is nowhere in the Media Authority's official series of roles. But also that the Media Authority itself is in some ways captured by the National Security Service. The Amnesty report, which came out last week, talks about this in other areas, but the National Security Service has a number of personnel deployed in various civil society organizations as a kind of surveillance role. And it was widely believed that at the time that I was there, so this is early 2018, that the deputy head of the Media Authority, a guy called John Mahok Chadal, was working for the NSS. So he had a long reputation of having been an NSS agent for a number of years, running up to the establishment of the Media Authority. And then when the Media Authority was established, he was one of the people who was put in charge of kind of relaying information on what was happening with journalists who wasn't writing certain kinds of things, and that this would feed back. And so journalists would sometimes find that things that had been raised to the attention of the Media Authority would come back at them when an NSS agent came to say hi or came to ask them questions, or vice versa. So things that they had gotten in trouble with the NSS for things they had written or conversations they had would pop out in consequences from the Media Authority. And there was this widespread perception that there was this channel that runs between the two things. And so far from being an ombudsman to protect free media, the media authority was in many ways just a pleasant, acceptable face for the NSS's work around media regulation in the country. In some cases, this would take quite a literal form. So in Juba, for the handful of newspapers that operate in the capital, there was one single press that the newspapers would need to use to produce their reports and print their editions. And frequently there would be quite literal NSS censors waiting at the press. So you would arrive with documents you wanted to print for the run of your newspaper for the next day. And the NSS censors would go through that. And in an isolated handful of cases, if newspapers were printing something was sufficiently objectionable, the NSS would strike those pages from the newspaper, and those journalists would find themselves getting a phone call from the media authority a day or two later. More sort of complicatedly was this idea, in stark contrast to the Media Authority Act, which stipulated that there would be no accreditation of journalists, that there was no credentials required, either for publications or for journalists themselves. The Media Authority ran a fairly detailed system of accreditation for which journalists had to pay. And it would break down in different ways. So for South Sudanese journalists, there would be a recurring license to practice journalism, without which they risked arrest or eviction from press conferences or interviews with government officials. And for foreign journalists, a slightly more complicated system was put in place, whereby in order to enter the country as a foreign journalist, one would need to make an application at the embassies for a specific journalist visa. To get a journalist visa would require first nominating someone in South Sudan, an NGO or a person who would, in a sense, sponsor or act as surety for the journalist who was entering the country. And only once they had that could they apply to the Media Authority for a letter of no objection to their entry in the country. And so once they received a letter of no objection from the Media Authority, and they were free to enter, they could then obtain a journalism visa, enter the country, and would then have to present themselves to the Media Authority to secure journalism accreditation, as well as a number of other permits around having cameras, wanting to film, and other bits and pieces. And this was understood widely by a lot of journalists as a system of control that was in some ways quite clever, because the Media Authority, in their view, had realized that unlike local journalists for whom consequences could be brought for their publishing, there was a danger with foreign journalists that foreign journalists were free to, in a sense, parachute in, do their reporting, and then publish from a safe distance. And so this idea of having someone vouch for you, coupled with the letter of no objection required from the Media Authority, meant that they could, on the one hand, block foreign journalists coming in whose reporting they found to be problematic, or if journalists were allowed in, the journalists had an incentive to report in ways that wouldn't anger the government, the Media Authority, or the National Security Service, simply because even if those journalists could leave, the idea of having a local party vouch for you meant that there was someone who, in a sense, was a hostage, a sort of collateral to whom consequences could apply. And a lot of journalists talked about finding this being problematic. So journalists who had written stories about the South Sudanese government, which had been critical in the past, found themselves unable to return. And journalists who were able to return spoke of this, I suppose, ethical legal problem of how to balance critical reporting on the conflict and its effects with the consequences for their informants, many of whom were not able to leave the country and were stuck with the ire of the government for what people abroad might publish. So the Media Authority is this interesting case of a body that exists in law, and if one were to look from very, very far away and understand the Media Authority through its legal documents, is a perfectly fine, healthy, well-behaved ombudsman type entity, but in its actual day-to-day functioning is wildly, wildly disconnected from its legal form. And so one of the questions that popped up repeatedly was how journalists managed to navigate the danger from an organization that ostensibly should be there to protect them, or at least to give them fair hearing for the material they're writing and the work that they're doing. There seemed to be, in South Sudan, there were two lines to this. On the one hand, there were organizations such as an NGO from Canada called Journalists for Human Rights, who would engage with the Media Authority in a very sort of soft educational approach. So would arrange town halls where journalists could raise issues with the Media Authority, and would run workshops for members of the Media Authority to talk to them about things like peace journalism, the role of journalism in civil society, these sorts of things. And for the most part, this had very little effect over the years in adjusting the behavior of the Media Authority. The counter position, though, was, to try and litigate against the Media Authority and to try and bring its de facto qualities in line with its qualities in law. But again, there was a number of respondents reflected a reservation that the problem was that if one brought too much legal pressure onto the media authority, it wasn't clear that what would happen was the media authority might adjust itself to fit its legal form. What might happen is simply that the legal form might adjust to accommodate or rationalize or give structure to the form as it existed in practice. And so simply saying, because this organization is misbehaving according to its legal mandate, one should bring a giant legal hammer to fix it, may not be the best solution to the problem. Other journalists took a more sort of pragmatic role around this. And so rather than distancing themselves from organizations like the NSS or the Media Authority, would actively go about trying to cultivate very close relationships with members of the Media Authority or of the National Security Service, and sometimes of the police, that they could then talk to or call on if they came into trouble. So one South Sudanese photojournalist explained it through an anecdote of saying, look, if I get arrested, what I would do is take out my pocketbook and I would see who is the person I am friends with who is senior to the person who is arresting me, but not so senior that I'm expending political capital that I don't need to waste on this particular this particular arrest. And so through keeping close relationships with members of the security service, a kind of paradoxical practice, a lot of journalists were able to have people who would sympathize with them enough that they could get off being detained or being stopped by security agents for a range of sort of lesser offenses. In other cases, journalists who had access to international organizations, so both South Sudanese and foreign journalists who were working for international organizations, were in some respects protected from some of the worst of the prosecution from Media Authority or the National Security Service, not the accreditation rules, but they were less likely to be picked on for what they wrote, partly because of a worry of what might be written about picking on a journalist, but also that in some of the cases, foreign organizations were better able to just provide journalists with things like safe exit from the country if things got too tough, or times out in Nairobi if they needed to sort of hide from the Media Authority for a few months until particular issues blew over. This is very much a whistle-stop tour on the Media Authority and National Security Service, but it's one of the large areas that sort of affected a lot of the day-to-day working of journalists. They needed to accommodate what these organizations might think and how it might tie to the National Security Service's concerns and the consequences that this might have for journalists. The second thing I want to talk about briefly is the economics of foreign correspondence and conflict reporting in general, and how this intersected with the South Sudan case. So, to most who've done anything on journalism and foreign correspondence and its changes over the year, it'll come as no surprise that there is less and less money and things are very expensive when you want to go and report on conflicts. And this is very much true in the South Sudanese case. There's all of the usual things about declining freelancer rates, the difficulties of getting permanent jobs or prepaid commissions to do conflict reporting work. All of this is true. Two things I wanted to highlight, though, is the ways in which this declining economics of foreign reporting intersect with inflation in South Sudan, or war economies generally, and a sort of dual system between dollars and South Sudanese pounds that has effects for the way that journalists could work. So the first of these is just that when working in a place like South Sudan, as one might expect, certain things like the cost of equipment, safe travel, accommodation, access to sites outside the capital city, all of these sorts of things rapidly become very, very expensive because almost by definition, they're things that are in short supply. And when one doesn't have the favor to secure them for free, one would need to pay for them. And so this creates a situation familiar to those who work on humanitarian journalist relationships, where journalists substantially often need to rely on NGOs for certain kinds of things. So for transport to field sites, for access to accommodation on United Nations bases that can protect them, these sorts of things. This cashes out in reality in interesting ways. So the idea that journalists need to develop relationships with NGOs to secure things like safe travel, accommodation, things that are just too expensive for them to purchase themselves anymore, to have any real prospect of paying for, requires that they nurture relationships with NGOs. And this can work in either good or bad ways. On the one hand, some of these, it's interesting to see that a lot of these organizations relate to journalists, not strictly in terms of organizations where my organizational ideology is X and we are a humanitarian organization and impartial, and so our organizational ethos is ABC and we can or can't help you. Sometimes that does happen, But often it was interesting to see the relationships between journalists and those within humanitarian organizations and NGOs who could broker access for them to things like flights, safe accommodation, interviews, these sorts of things, often were negotiated on a far more personal level. And through the sort of weird interchange where a lot of people who ended up in roles like communications officers for NGOs either had normative commitments towards things like advocacy, or at least had views on who was responsible for certain elements of the conflict, or in many cases, these people had been practicing journalists in the past. This created a kind of norms alignment where whatever the organizational philosophy might be around taking journalists here and there or letting them do certain things, or collaborating with them, in practice, there was often a lot of discretion for humanitarian communications officers to work with journalists on specific things, insofar as they might give them a free seat on an airplane that wasn't being used, or offer them accommodation in a compound where this would fit in with stuff that they were doing already. This is interesting, I suppose, academically, because it points to when understanding how journalists and humanitarian NGOs work together, it's not always helpful to think at the level of the organization. So what is MSF's philosophy? How do humanitarians think about neutrality? And far more useful to think about the normative political commitments of journalists and humanitarians as actual people sitting in these situations who may have certain commitments to particular issues, either because they are previously ideologically predisposed certain ways, or in other instances because they're directly affected. So many humanitarian communications officers who were South Sudanese staff were personally affected by the war in many ways, and that left them with certain kinds of issues or ideas where they were often very willing to collaborate, or to allow journalists to a certain extent access to their infrastructure to do their reporting, because these issues were personally quite important to them. The second thing I then want to wrap up with, to talk about with economics, is the sort of two-tier financial economy, if you will. So on the one hand, there is declining funding internationally, if we're measuring in US dollar terms, for journalists to be able to do the reporting that they want to do. But within South Sudan, there is a separate economy, not paid for in international money, US dollars, but paid for in South Sudanese pounds. And this is, South Sudanese radio stations, South Sudanese newspapers, media organizations, all responsible for reporting the conflict, though not often to foreign audiences, to the people of South Sudan themselves. And due to South Sudan's particular long history of financial mismanagement, the South Sudanese pound is, certainly at the time that I was there, and this is exacerbated, was hyperinflated. And so the salaries of journalists being paid not in a dollar track. So if you weren't earning your money from a foreign organization or from a humanitarian organization, you were being paid by a South Sudanese organization. The money that you were being paid was getting worth less and less and less at an astonishingly rapid rate. And this had the effect that essentially the economics of your incoming and outgoing costs, your salary, a whole bunch of stuff, were tied to the currency that you were earning money in. If journalists were able to work in a dollar economy, there was at least the potential of being able to collaborate with the NGOs to find bits and pieces of work that give you the money that would allow you to pay for and work in out of capital locations, to engage in some sort of travel, to pay for things like insurance, these sorts of things. If you were employed and working in South Sudanese pounds, you were trapped in an economy where there was very little ability to pay for any of these sorts of things. With hyperinflated South Sudanese pounds, the cost of these things were just wildly out of reach. And so this creates a sort of gap where the dynamics of people working in a South Sudanese dominated journalist economy, if you will, and the people working in a dollar denominated one function in some respects quite differently. So for many South Sudanese journalists earning South Sudanese pounds, there was often this idea that, look, this isn't a tenable job because I'm not earning enough to pay for essentially meals, accommodation, very basic expenses. The money that I'm earning in South Sudanese pounds just is insufficient to cover these costs. And so for South Sudanese journalists, this would often lead to a huge churn in journalists, where becoming a journalist was essentially largely a preoccupation of, ultimately, I want to be doing something else, ideally better earning, preferably in a dollar economy of the international interveners. So one frequently related career trajectory was to start off working as a journalist and then use that as a way of bulking up one's CV or making the contacts that would allow you to migrate into becoming a communications officer for an NGO, for example, and making a jump out of journalism. And so there was this feeling of, look, I'm going to give it a shot for a certain time, and then if it doesn't work out, I'll go do something else. But first prize would be to migrate into this other NGO dollarized income sphere. So this meant that compared to those working in the sort of dollar economy, for many of whom had been practicing, South Sudanese and foreign journalists who'd been practicing as journalists for many years, journalists working for South Sudanese publications paid in local currency would experience this sort of huge churn. And so there's very different skills gap, very little crossover, where people earning in dollars had very few incentives to work for organizations that could pay in pounds. And so one of the things you never see is foreign journalists who enter in dollar-paying jobs deciding to write for South Sudanese publications to talk about elements of the conflict to South Sudanese audiences. It's just not a thing that happens, partly perhaps for ideological reasons, but also for very good economic ones, that there's just, it's a dangerous economy to get caught up in because it doesn't offer anything like a sustainable career going forward. How do journalists survive then? So if working in a South Sudanese pound-based side of the economy, or to some extent as people even working in the dollar internationally paid side of things, it can still be very, very hard to make ends meet. And so there were various ways that journalists would relate, trying to cope with this. I mean, the most obvious one that'd be familiar to many in the audience, is this sort of collaboration with NGOs. So these are organizations that can pay in dollars, for which there's often regular work creating media for advocacy and publicity of the projects that they're doing. And this then throws up a bunch of familiar ethical questions of, at what point does it destabilize my role as being a journalist when I'm doing this sort of work for NGOs? And it was interesting that in the eyes of journalists, this question of, am I too close to NGOs? Am I allowed to take part-time work for them? Would cut differently depending on the kinds of media that people were working in. So if you were a writer and you spent a lot of your time writing copy for NGOs, you were often seen as being compromised to an extent or in ways that was not true of people who were photographers and videographers. Like, it was perfectly fine as an accepted practice for photographers to freelance shooting images for NGOs, and then to swap out to go and do actual real reporting later. And sometimes even to make this sort of artificial distinction of the frames that I've shot for the NGO, I can take some frames and these are my commercial journalism frames, and these frames are for NGO work frames. And conceptually, this isn't a problem because they're kind of separate objects. This sort of distinction didn't exist for people working, for example, in writing. And so the ability to collaborate with NGOs, and to different extents, seems to be in part conditioned by the kind of work that someone was doing. Another fairly banal way that journalists would try and cope with the sheer expense of doing the job in an economy that often wouldn't pay you enough to do the job was through subsidies of various kinds. And often this would take the form of just having a really wealthy spouse. So there were journalists who had partners who were in the humanitarian world and would tag along wherever it was that they were working for the United Nations or an MSF or an Oxfam or whatever, and they would work as journalists on the side. And this had the perk that they were able to take advantage legitimately of things like free accommodation, preferential connections within certain organizations to get access to infrastructure that would let them do their work. So flights, travel to different places, these sorts of things. And this was a kind of romantic subsidy, if you will, that got paid out that they could not have to pay for these things themselves. Others, were just hustle inside jobs that could range from anything from being a personal trainer to life coaching to driving a taxi to hawking fruits and vegetables, all sorts of things. So journalists would actually be really, really creative. And if you look at how many would spend their days, if there was an event on, or there was a particular story that we're focusing on, then that might take up part of the day, but the rest of the week, or when not focusing on that thing, they would be doing whatever the sort of primary gig was. And that was interesting because it speaks to the degree to which, as the economics of journalism become more and more precarious, it starts to look more and more like a thing that is a part-time job the journalists in these areas are engaged in, or is something that, whatever their primary occupation, is something that they feel they ought to do because they have political commitments to it, or they feel like it's an important thing to do, regardless of whether or not it's a profitable career. The last thing I want to mention on this point before we wrap up and take some questions is this collaboration between NGOs and humanitarian organizations played into problems with the media authority in interesting kinds of ways in South Sudan. And so part of this was that the media authority, seeing itself as an organization whose job it was to enforce best practice around not criticizing the government, seeing the media as a security concern, meant that to the extent that journalists collaborated with NGOs and humanitarian organizations, they found themselves getting caught up in the politics of this. So at the time that I was doing my research, the Media Authority was trying to make a push to get humanitarian and NGO organizations to have to register with the Media Authority as media organizations. And from the Media Authority's point of view, this seemed entirely reasonable because on the one hand, these were organizations that were working quite closely, facilitating journalists in doing their reporting work, but also in some situations, again, from the point of view of the Media Authority, humanitarian organizations were media organizations. So they were taking photographs, they were talking about the conflict, they were framing it in various terms for audiences. They were doing everything that functionally a newsroom would do, just without calling themselves journalists or newsroom. And so to the extent that the Media Authority saw their role as being control of these sorts of matters, they saw humanitarian organizations as falling under their rules around speech, reporting, and journalism. And this was a problem that the NGOs at the time were trying to deal with in initially a very kind of subtle way by just really not trying to engage with the Media Authority on this and not trying to give the issue any sort of credence, because there was a reluctance to sort of sit down and have that discussion out in the open, because it would produce a confrontation that they certainly didn't want to pick. Okay, I think that's, let me not ramble on too much. I'm far more interested to hear, questions that people might have. I realize this is an absolutely whistle-stop tour through some of the challenges facing journalists in South Sudan and the ways they're going about coping with this. If there are things that people would like me to expand on, please let me know. Otherwise, in the chat, I think Emily has posted a link to the thesis. I thought it was gripping reading, but I'm hopelessly biased at this point. So if you'd like to read this and more in a lot more detail, that's one place to find. Cool, and got a question from Bobby. Can I draw a bit on the topic of journalist workarounds? Can you tell me more about how they evolve and how journalists are socialized into their use? Are they patterned ways in which they learn from each other the most effective mechanisms of circumvention? That is an interesting question. So I suspect, so I think, yes, there is a degree of sharing. And I think that my impression from what I saw is that the sharing is partitioned in interesting kinds of ways. So people who, so to give you an example, within South Sudan, within Juba, the capital, journalists would often be organized into two groups, often by location. So there was at the time journalists' hotel, a place called Lagali House, where the foreign press would hang out. And this was a place that had a little bit of a vibe of a Le Carre novel, where you would have everyone from very unscrupulous British expats doing shady deals, to journalists, to aid workers hanging out in sort of cosmopolitan humanitarian space. And then there was an organization called AMDIS, which was the Association for Media Development, which was in a compound somewhat removed from the hotel in another part of the city. And that was, the Association for Media Development was a safe haven for South Sudanese journalists to collaborate and work together. And for a variety of reasons, often those communities didn't mix with each other. And so I think to the extent that people do assist each other with workarounds or ways of kind of not gaming the system, but dealing with the challenges posed by organizations like the Media Authority, I think a lot of that knowledge is passed on within communities that are often quite separate. So both who hangs out with who talks about these sorts of issues, but also, again, like, if just taking those two communities as an example, those communities have different access to certain sorts of resources. So the people who hang out in the cosmopolitan sphere of humanitarian international hotel, they would have personal contacts, for example, far richer with things like the United Nations, the peacekeeper force there, or other large NGOs. And so there's kinds of patronage, power, leverage that they would have access to through those networks that wouldn't be available to South Sudanese journalists working at AMDIS. But South Sudanese journalists working at AMDIS would often have much, much closer connections to civil society or leaders in different areas, to members of the intelligence services, to those sorts of organizations. And so the networks that each could draw on would be substantially different in at least those respects. Ravati, class position of South Sudanese journalists: being a fruit vendor on the side of being connected to someone's boss when they're arrested, speak to a huge range of personal status, power. Yeah. So this is absolutely true. I mean, one of the hierarchies that seems to have emerged within South Sudanese journalists was around this question of where people had studied where people had studied to do their journalism. And this was, some had studied at the University of Juba, some had studied at the University of Makerere in Uganda, and some had studied in Khartoum from the period where South Sudan and Sudan were still one country. And that was one hierarchy. So journalists would often sort of suss out from each other where you had studied, and where you had studied was taken to speak a lot about the kind of connections you were assumed to have, and the quality of your professionalism of journalism as it were. So Makerere in Uganda carried very, very high cachet with a lot of the journalist community, and a lot of those who did, South Sudanese journalists who worked for wire services or overseas organizations often were graduates of Makerere or University in Khartoum. And within those networks was a preference for sharing opportunities to work for different organizations, sometimes within those sorts of circles, with the University of Juba sort of trailing behind. So that was part of it. I think as well, and I didn't delve into this enough to speak in perhaps detail, but I think that probably many of the same class and other power dynamics that allow journalists in the West to get certain kinds of privileged access to protection, to sources, to these sorts of things, are very much at play in South Sudan as well. So I think partly to the extent that one is able to have a secure side job to support journalism as a philanthropic hobby, or as a kind of investment in a future payoff, speaks to sort of class privilege. I haven't mentioned this explicitly, but gender is a huge, huge structure amongst a lot of the journalists, particularly South Sudanese journalists. There are very prominent female journalists. The correspondent for Al Jazeera, Huba Morgan, was a female journalist. The head of the Juba Monitor, the largest paper in Juba, were both women. But in general, it's very, very rare to see women working in journalism. And this is, a whole kind of separate conversation, but there's a very, very stark division along that kind of line, for example. So to the extent that journalists are trading on, much as is the case anywhere else, translating class, education, other sorts of advantages into access to sources and the ability to kind of network in a way that'll let them do their jobs and let them do their jobs safely, you see similar kinds of dynamics, certainly in the case in South Sudan. Zeno. Professionalization of act. Yeah, so journalists, there is this problem, I think, with the fact that the economics of foreign correspondence have reached this point that it's very, very difficult to do reporting on a beat like South Sudan and be entirely financially self-sufficient purely on the reporting of that beat. And I think the day is probably long past when one could be financially self-sufficient enough reporting on a beat like South Sudan that you could afford to pay for your own flights. You could reimburse the United Nations for the cost of putting you up on their protected bases, those sorts of things. So I think it's inevitable that journalists have to sort of engage in this work, and the work that in some ways I suppose most easily fits with the sort of stuff that they're doing is this work with NGOs. There's a lot of synergies there. So it means access to infrastructure that you would have needed anyway to do reporting that you want to do. And in some respects, the materials that journalists are producing and the materials that humanitarians will be producing resemble each other quite closely. I think it's an interesting question of whether or not, like, how this affects journalists' positions. And it depends, I suppose, their position in virtue of whose eyes. So to give you an example of what I mean when I say that, the media authority, for example, would keep track of which journalists they disliked. And if you were to try and come in to the country if you're a foreign journalist and they denied you a visa or they'd kicked you out, and you tried to re-enter the country and say, well, no, this time I'm working for an NGO. I'm not doing my journalism work. I'm doing my not-for-profit humanitarian work. They wouldn't accept that. So they would, in a sense, your hat as a journalist and the work that you've done as a journalist was trailing you into the humanitarian realm and was, at least in the eyes of the government, denying you access to just be a humanitarian media worker. On the other hand, I mean, humanitarian media workers, some of them would, I suppose, embrace the role wholeheartedly and, run straight into advocacy. Others who had previously been journalists, so both South Sudanese and foreign journalists who had come into humanitarian comms roles, often had a sort of perhaps more nuanced middle position. So there was a sense of, look, what I'm doing is advocacy, and it is about bringing attention to the conflict and showing the good work that my humanitarian organization is doing. But also that I think there are principles around how I do that work that are kind of journalistically aligned. Others have written on this, and examples of, I think they talk about journalists coming out of the war in Yugoslavia en masse. I think this is Kate Wright's work, moving into a lot of humanitarian comms roles, and how that's kind of shifted some of the culture around how humanitarian comms organizations think about the work that they're doing. I know Shani Orgad at LSE has written work on how this plays out amongst NGOs themselves. So talking about how within NGOs, there are often these debates about, look, are we doing advocacy work around getting donor money, so it's a purely marketing exercise, or are we trying to represent the conflict or talk about what's happening in a journalistic sort of sense? So, a different set of standards, different set of motivations. And I think that's interesting. So seeing journalists moving into NGOs complicates things a lot. So it complicates things for the NGOs who find questions arising about what they're doing with their mediation of their work and how it ought to be done. But it also, I think, opens doors to further collaboration with journalists. So it's created a world where when journalists often approach NGOs and say, look, I need access to this particular sort of area or this thing I need to do. Can you give me access to it? You see a lot more sympathy when the NGO officers are previously journalists. To give an example of this, so in my fieldwork, I followed two journalists who were going to Malakal to investigate what appeared to be a war crimes violation in a village quite far up the Nile. And the NGO communications officer that they approached to get flights on a UN flight, but also to be hosted at one of the peacekeeper bases in the north, gave them double the amount of time that they'd thought they would be able to get to hang out safely within the UN infrastructure. And then when they arrived there, the press officers there were quite sympathetic to letting them hop onto helicopters to get to more remote areas. They really went all out to give them access to UN infrastructure that was entirely a discretionary resource, and they didn't have to do it. And part of this, when asking the comms officers about it, they would reflect on how they themselves had been journalists and they understood the sort of manifest importance of what these journalists were working on. And so to the extent that it wouldn't cost the organization or wasn't likely to cost the organization or run risks in terms of reputation, this was a thing that they could like discretionarily help the journalists with. And so, yeah, not to put too fine a point on it, there's something interesting happening when you see people who had experience as journalists moving into roles where they have discretionary control of a lot of the safe infrastructure that journalists make use of. It gives them an in to that world, even as at the same time it might kind of complicate the division between journalism work and humanitarianism work. Yeah, Mira, on blind spots and methodology. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I initially entered South Sudan to do ethnographic work as a researcher, and so when I went to the embassy, I didn't apply for a journalism visa. I asked if there was a researcher visa, and there wasn't such a thing. And so I got given a tourist visa. And so that allowed me to go in. And for the most part, in the early, so two things that are maybe worth talking about. Initially was this phenomenon of, as you go into a world, particularly in ethnographic style work and interviewing lots and lots of journalists, I'd originally intended to interview journalists and then towards the end of my research, go and talk to the media authority, and if I could, the National Security Service. And what came clearer as research progressed was after the 5th, 6th, 7th, 20th, 30th interview, where journalists would talk about their fear of the National Security Service and being tapped and being followed, their fear of the media authority and what it could do. By the end of my research, I was terrified of going to talk to the media authority. And there's a anthropologist called Anna Shisterenina who talks about a similar sort of dynamic in research in Abkhazia, is that partly, whether it's in interview work or ethnographic work, often the longer you're sort of sitting in a situation, it's hard not to become aligned with the perspectives of the people that you're talking to, particularly when those perspectives virtually unanimously come to fear certain people, certain objects, certain institutions. And so in the thesis, I reflect on this in a lot more length, but it's absolutely the view that I have of the role of the media authority, the role of licensing in the obstruction of the work of journalists and the hardships they face is absolutely a view that comes sitting from with the journalists. And in the end, I didn't get to talk to the media authority for two reasons. The one is that I was actually quite afraid of them by the end of my research fieldwork. But the second was that in accompanying journalists to go and access this remote field site for their reporting, in order to tag along, I had to go to the airport. We all had to the day before, so that an NSS officer could screen you. So the way flights work in the country is to travel anywhere, whether with the United Nations or on a private airline, you have to go to a National Security Service officer who clears you that you're allowed to travel first. And so this gentleman looked at the journalists and saw that they had all of their credentials in order, and this was fine. I didn't have credentials because I wasn't a journalist, but I was clearly not a tourist because that made no sense either. And so through a long series of ping pong, I ended up being sent to the media authority. And in that meeting with them, it became very clear that they had been aware and watching me during my research at various different points. So when I had gone to press conferences to watch the journalist reporting, as I'd been moving around Juba conducting interviews, they made it clear in talking to me that they were aware of a lot of what I'd been doing and that they disapproved of it. And vaguely threatening sort of language. And so I had to go and apply to them for permission in order to do research on journalists. I needed to get a new class of credential that they would invent for me. What was interesting about that from an evidence point of view as well was just that when this document came back that said you are now cleared to travel from the media authority who gave it to me, that document was stamped and signed by the NSS. So my approval to go and travel had gone through the media authority to the NSS, and this document had come back with NSS stamps and signatures, saying something, I suspect, about kind of where the decision about who I was and how I was allowed to travel took place. And so by the end of the trip, I was very on edge about dealing with the organization. And it is, I think, it is a limit on the research. I think there is a very valuable and interesting project to be done by someone else on those sorts of organizations. So what is it that the media authority thinks that it's doing? Because presumably it doesn't think that it is the big bad in the way that journalists think it is. And I think that would be a fascinating project, but I think that it would be impossible to do both. So I think if one were to sit and research in depth with media authority, you would become very distrusted by journalists, and to the extent that one sits in the journalism world, it becomes hard to access the other side. And I think that this is a larger problem around, to some extent, doing this sort of work in conflicts is where you have these sort of very polarized communities. It can be difficult not to find yourself getting caught up in seeing the world from the community that you're researching, I mean, quite clearly, but also that it produces difficulties in how, or if it's even possible, to sort of step across to the other side. To Bobby, following Zena's question, argues that NGO intervention severely constrains what can be reported. Is this the common sentiment amongst journalists who engaged with, and are there cases where they split over whether or not they will accept NGO intervention? So that is interesting. There was a feeling that NGOs could interfere with the work that a journalist was doing. There were two flavors of this. The one was a sort of positive, so many of the journalists I spoke to were very, very reluctant to go on anything that looked or smelled like a press trip. So if an NGO approached them and said, we would like to assist you to go to cover something that we think is important, if journalists took that up, it would often just be because the money was very good, and or they could negotiate some sort of time off to go do their own thing. But they were very conscious of the fact that they were being set up to see some sort of NGO Potemkin village type situation. And the press junkets were often, like, by foreign journalists, treated quite derisively. For a number of South Sudanese journalists, these were actually seen as very, very valuable opportunities. So the World Food Program, for example, would often allow or make allowance for South Sudanese journalists to travel with them on their flights to remote areas, doing kind of famine preparedness, or in aid of news stories that they wanted promoted in South Sudanese press about how and where to get assistance for changing of seasons, these sorts of things. This was an interesting dynamic, just because generally when people talk about journalists of conflict or war, the focus seems is often to see through the kind of Western paradigm of the foreign reporter going in and reporting on the conflict for some sort of outside cosmopolitan audience. And there's a whole world of journalists from the country reporting on the conflict to citizens in the country, because there is an obvious and immediate need for them to understand what is happening, how to deal with the situation. And so often we're there to the extent that journalism isn't so much taking a watchdog type role and more of a, I suppose the word would be development role, or assistance educational role. And there were very obvious synergies that some South Sudanese reporters would see with the work of NGOs, so that they could get access to these things and write articles that journalists would find, that citizens would find valuable and useful. Where there was often friction between NGO assistance or NGO shelter might come about when NGOs felt that the journalists were too much of a risk to the NGO. So sometimes this would be matters of branding, so we won't let you go to a certain place because we don't want you to see something. Other times it may be that journalists actively just embarrass an NGO in mid-field trip, and this gets them in trouble. An example that kept getting repeated by respondents almost as a kind of morality tale was of a journalist called Justin Lynch, who had been had traveled to one of the United Nations peacekeeping bases where they're protecting civilians from attack from outside. There's sort of these enormous protection of civilian sites surrounded by fortified walls. And he was there at the time that this particular protection of civilian site was attacked by a militia from outside. And the United Nations press comms officer was telling the rest of the world, when journalists were asking about this, no, there's no attack, nothing's happening, everything is fine. And then the United Nations discovered that Lynch was from somewhere in the compound live tweeting the attack. And this produced huge friction between the UN and him, to the extent that the NGO that he was with, so the story goes, hid him under a bed because the United Nations was going door to door to try and find and evict this journalist because he was harming the narrative that they were trying to put out. And journalists were very much aware of this sort of don't poke the bear relationship with the NGO, that being put on a blacklist carried real consequences. When I was in Juba, there was a mixer between NGO comms officers and a number of journalists, which again speaks to a whole world of sort of personal connections and networks. But in that mixer, one of the journalists pointing out there was a story which had just recently broken about sexual assault by UN troops in a base, I think it was in Wau. And she was saying how she was totally aware that this was a story and had known about it. But as she saw it, if she broke the story, if she was the first to report on it, the consequences would be that this would need to be the last story she ever wrote, that the United Nations would then cut her out of, or blacklist her from flights and accommodation, and so much of the safe infrastructure that just made the job possible that it would be untenable as a career to continue working in South Sudan. So there's very much this dance of, if I bring you on in and I assist you, not just what are the benefits to me, but kind of what potential harms might journalists bring about. And from journalists' end, there was an awareness of this sort of dance as well. From Mel, how did insights for elsewhere did interviews compare South Sudan to other places they'd worked? Do you have a car? Yeah, so my project wasn't explicitly comparative, so comparing South Sudan to other situations, but it has been something that's been on my mind a lot in the last few months. I mean, in particular, so having dug into this a little bit, places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, interestingly, also run something like this kind of sponsor system. So to get access to the country and accredited as, so firstly, there's journalism accreditation, again, is this mechanism of filtering, but also that there's this idea of the local proxy. So you have to be invited by someone, and that someone is a person that we can hold responsible for you if you report in a naughty sort of fashion. I found that interesting, and I'm starting to wonder whether there mightn't be a larger project here around like just the sorts of cookie cutter, almost bureaucratic rules, procedures that regimes can put into place to keep journalists out. So this idea of filtering through accreditation, that's fairly widely known. But these ideas of keeping a local person as a hostage, in a sense, this sort of stuff, if it's the case in two, might it be the case elsewhere, I think is a very interesting one. I think as well, and it's sort of in the background to what I've talked about so far, is that a lot of these conflicts perhaps in general are not just these anarchic, chaotic zones like you might imagine, but often are very, very tightly structured in terms of infrastructure, bureaucracies, these sorts of things, particularly when you're dealing with conflicts that have large involvement by international NGOs, by the United Nations, or by major state militaries. I'm thinking here of like Iraq and Afghanistan and the involvement of the US military. Those sorts of areas, the moment you see that those sort of large organizations involvement, they tend to produce an infrastructure for safe travel, for safe accommodation, for getting around otherwise dangerous spaces efficiently and cheaply or for free, as long as you can negotiate the connections to get access to their little boxed up worlds. And there's people who write about this in the humanitarian conflict studies literature. They call it aid land or peace land. But I think that there's, to the extent that in South Sudan, the ability to evade the government, its security services, its consequences by staying inside a humanitarian bubble, by traveling with peacekeepers, by living in that world, and to an extent out of the clutches of government, I think there's good reason to believe that journalists might make and would make use of similar infrastructures in other places. So it's no coincidence that many journalists who have traveled between different conflicts would know that if this is one where the United Nations is heavily involved, you would go to the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, because these are the people who would broker your access to UN flights. And so there's a sort of replicated infrastructure from conflict to conflict that I think journalists would imagine and make use of in similar kind of ways across different situations. I think we have 2 minutes left, so I'm unfortunately going to probably wrap it up there. Bobby, is that good? I'm worried that people have places to be in their different time zones, and I don't want to keep everyone waiting too much.
Rich, thank you so much. Let me just get back in sight here. I think there, yes. Here we go. Thank you so much. I think both the talk and the questions were extraordinarily generative. And I'm actually happy that we're leaving with Mel Bunce's question, because I think that it, at the risk of wanting to know so much about a place that we know so little, I think that the comparative dimensions really, really kind of shout to be at some level addressed. And I think we're all going to walk away from this colloquium thinking about them. So I thank you very much, and looking forward to the work.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.